Okay, we're recording, and so I'll start by sharing my screen. Hello and welcome, and thank you for attending our session, Returning to School, Supporting Students' Social Emotional Learning. We're excited to have you and look forward to engaging with you over the next 45 minutes. We have allotted time at the end for questions, but please feel free to react or ask questions anytime in the chat. As we begin and align to the theme of the Institute, today we're going to be thinking about reimagining inclusive education and reframing students' abilities and growth through multi-tiered systems of support. As part of this reimagining, we need to focus not on learning loss, but rather on meeting the needs of students, educators, and all in our school communities where they are through a trauma-informed approach. Certainly, we have all experienced loss over the last year to year and a half, but we also know that not everyone who shares our educational spaces has experienced this, whether in person or virtually. We've all experienced this moment differently. As we continue to move through what some experts have described as a triple pandemic due to COVID-19, systemic racism, and mental health, we must be willing to work together to meet students where they are with care and empathy. And with that, I will turn it over to Layla.
All right, so let's go ahead and get started today by doing a mindful moment. And so mindfulness really helps people to let go of what's going on around them, what's going on in their mind, and really get in touch with their own personal lives. And really all mindfulness requires is awareness, that present moment thinking, and those non-judgmental observations. And so as you're engaging in a mindfulness exercise, when you start to get those thoughts in your mind, it really is about just not being judgmental of your own self and just observing what's going on with your body, what's going on with those thoughts, and then just continuing with that practice. And these are skills that must be learned and they must be practiced ongoing. We always like to invite all staff as well as students to engage in these practices. They can be differentiated in multiple ways. It could be breathing exercises, you can do movement exercises, or they can even be interactive mindful moments for our students. So today, I'm going to go ahead and get started by inviting you to do a mindful moment with us. And we do this as an invitation because we want to make sure that we're taking a trauma-informed approach with this work, especially with what Michelle had just mentioned about the pandemic and all of the traumas that we have faced in the past year and a half. It's really important that we never force students to do anything that they're not comfortable with, and really just provide that time and space for them to feel comfortable and get used to doing these practices. And so with that said, I invite you to find a comfortable seat. So you can either sit or you can stand if that's more comfortable for you. Today I'm going to sit. You want to have your feet flat on the floor. You want to straighten your spine, relax your shoulders, and then have your face looking straight ahead. So you just want to have that alignment in your body. Now, if you feel comfortable, I invite you to relax your eyes. You can either close them halfway or you can fully close your eyes. Now, I just want you to take a moment to notice how your body feels. If you're sitting, how does it feel in your chair? If you're standing, how does your body feel above the ground? Now bring your attention to your breath. Take gentle, steady breaths for about the next 30 seconds. We'll do this together. You're going to inhale and exhale. I want you to continue to inhale and exhale at a pace that feels comfortable for you. Feel the air as it enters through your nose and exits out your mouth. I want you to notice any thoughts as they come and go. If you find yourself becoming attached to a thought, simply just notice it. Remember, we're not going to be judgmental. We're only observing the thoughts that are entering their minds. Now I want to take a few more breaths together. We're going to inhale, exhale. Now on this one, I invite you to take your biggest breath of the day. You're going to breathe in and out. Now bring your attention back to this moment. Notice the room around you again. Now you're going to take this focus and this attention with you throughout the day.
Layla, thank you for that time of mindful self-awareness. Too often we aren't permitted the time to connect and reset. I can see where I need to be intentional about building in opportunities for me to practice this as a teacher and with my pre-service teachers and across content areas. Perhaps you see a need for this in your space too. We'd like to introduce ourselves and tell you a little bit about your presenters here today. I'll start. Hi, my name is Michelle Damiani. I'm a professor of inclusive education at Rowan University. And prior to joining Rowan and in teacher education, I was an elementary special education teacher for 6 years. Tyla?
Welcome everyone. My name is Tyla Dwarka and I'm a recent graduate of NYU Steinhardt, where I studied educational leadership and policy studies. My areas of focus are school discipline, culturally responsive education, and student support services. And right now I'm currently the administrative aide for the field learning department at NYU Silver School of Social Work, where I work on pairing students with internships. Layla?
Hi, everyone. My name is Layla D. Heyman. I'm the Director of School Climate here at Albuquerque Public Schools in the great state of New Mexico. I am also a doctoral candidate at Syracuse University, where I'm focusing my research and my dissertation on restorative practices and the school to prison pipeline. With that said, we want to take a moment to do a land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge and honor the original people of New York, New Jersey, and New Mexico. We honor the land itself and those who remain great stewards of this land throughout the generations. We acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous people and to their practices. Now, we're going to drop in a link. It's native land, and you can go and look up the native land on which you are a resident at this time.
Okay, and where we're heading today. In this presentation, we're going to be talking about 4 best practices, meeting students where they are in a trauma-informed way, multi-tiered supports, culturally responsive practices, and restorative practices. We want to call your attention here to the point that social emotional learning needs to be proactive and responsive. In other words, every one of us in schools needs to proactively address social emotional learning in our roles, in our classrooms, and across content areas throughout the day for all students. So the next piece that you see here is responsive, and social emotional interventions must also be provided in response to specific needs. But notice the most effective social emotional learning comes proactively as well. And so support shouldn't just be happening in response to a need or when something goes wrong, but really intentionally implemented proactively from the start. Okay, and in this slide, we want to identify why we do this work and why it's important. And as I read these, be thinking about how we are always developing social emotional skills with our students, and also how we're developing these ideas in ourselves as educators. And so why do we do this work? We're integrating personal and social identities, identifying personal, cultural, and linguistic assets, identifying one's emotions, demonstrating honesty, integrity, and accountability, linking feelings, values, and thoughts, examining prejudices and biases, experiencing self-efficacy, having a growth mindset, and developing interests and a sense of purpose. We're going to be talking about applying many of these as we move through today's presentation, but hopefully this list gets us thinking about the many purposes that SEL can and should serve in our classrooms. And so right now, we want to invite everybody to think about this as a mindset shift. As educational professionals in many roles, we're so often overwhelmed. We have a lot on our plate, especially right now. Like our students, we have emotional needs that require attention. And so the analogy of a too full plate, I think, is very real for many of us. So now what, you ask? Too often, social emotional learning is thought of as a program or isolated skills. And in this way, it feels more like one more thing that we need to do, right? One more thing on an already too full plate. But we want to stress that social emotional learning is not a program. It's a paradigm shift about how we support each other more inclusively as holistic human beings. And from that mindset, we can better understand how social emotional learning, or SEL, is not one more thing on the plate, it is the plate. And everything that we do is connected to supporting social emotional learning as the foundation. So to wrap up this point, a reminder that we teach students, not programs, and all students need supported opportunities to develop these skills. And what about us? Adults and teachers too need these skills, right? So social emotional learning is not just for students. The social emotional learning and support is for everyone. And we encourage you to hold on to this idea, to challenge your own thinking, and to tie this to later activities when we are going to talk about how to embed SEL in our practices and approaches with students. And also, we want to talk about multi-tiered systems of supports. You're likely talking about tiered supports for students in your schools and thinking about how to provide those in your classroom. So here we're talking about developing tiered supports and interventions to address students' needs as we move from the base to the point of the triangle. Specifically, we want to situate this in terms of social emotional learning. And so you can see that the foundation of support includes things like culturally responsive supports for students, building positive relationships, and designing supportive environments, and helping students identify and manage their emotions. So these are things that we need to be doing in our schools for all students. And then we recognize that students might need more time and more intensive supports right now as we try and navigate some big feelings which impact students' academics and behavior. Additionally, we're also planning for targeted and specific students, meeting them where they're at with sometimes more intensive needs, again, in that humanistic, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed ways. And so just like we differentiate any kind of learning, we need to differentiate our social emotional learning and behavior supports as well.
All right, so let's delve into the 5 competencies of social emotional learning. So we really like to bring up the idea of relational ecology, and that our school systems are a larger ecological system, and we are all in relation with each other, right? So there are ways in which the district interacts with our schools, ways in which our schools interact with the classrooms, the individual classrooms within our schools, and then the ways that those people in those classrooms interact with each other. And so it's really important to think of the larger home and community, how that relates and interacts with schools, and then thinking about the ways in which we can embed each one of the CASEL competencies into these different groups. Because as we said, SEL is successful when everyone is practicing all of these competencies. And so with that said, there are lots of tools to begin planning and action planning for this work. CASEL has an interactive framework and theory of action so that you can go and begin to do really strong goal setting and action planning to implement this, whether it's in your classroom, whether it's in your school building, or whether it's in the larger school district. And we have a lot of other resources and experiences that we've all, done in our work that we can continue to help you along the way. So let's move into the actual competencies. So with this one, we really like to frame these as our individual competencies. These really relate to individual people. So self-awareness is the ability to identify your own emotions, your own thoughts, and your own values. This can really be achieved in classrooms and in school buildings through check-ins, through quiet reflections. We all went through a mindful exercise this morning. I always tell school principals we should do a mindful exercise at every staff meeting. Anytime we are together, we need to be engaging in these practices so that our students know that this is a way of being in our schools, that it's okay to identify your emotions. It's okay to identify your thoughts and your values and really start to process that. And this helps us to know, what does my body need? What does my mind need? And that leads us into the next competency, which is self-management. Self-management is very similar to awareness, but it's taking that awareness and putting it into action through management. So this can be achieved through goal setting, through having organizational skills or having lessons or dialogue about how to be organized. And this really helps our students and us as adults to know when we need to ask for our needs and when we need to set boundaries. And so it's really important to really understand how the two of these interact. One is identifying and the next is managing. Let's move on to our more community-based competencies. So these two competencies link directly to community and the ways in which individuals are in relation with each other. So coming back to that relational ecology that we talked about, right? So relationship skills are the ability to establish and maintain healthy and supportive relationships. This can be achieved in classrooms or school communities through connection circles, through ongoing conversations, opportunities to have dialogue, and those ongoing team building activities. Social awareness is the ability to understand and empathize with others. This can be supported in classrooms and in schools through having conversations about empathy, doing lessons about empathy, engaging in work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then having students or yourself as a practitioner, allowing that time and space to be reflective and then reflexive on your practices. So by keeping a journal, by developing prompts around social awareness, or really any of the competencies, it really supports the development of awareness as well as all competencies through the practice of journaling. Lastly is where we start to see the individual and the community overlap and intersect the most. And this is through responsible decision-making, which is the ability to make caring and constructive choices for yourself, that individual, as well as others, that larger community, right? Because we're always in relation with each other. This can be achieved through having authentic choices when issues arise or concerns come up, which can be achieved through restorative conversations or restorative mediations. It's really about allowing ownership of decisions and respect of choices in all settings. So this can also be achieved through holding circles to decide agreements for the classroom. So really allowing students to take ownership and what they're agreeing to be a part of this larger community. So they're developing that classroom management plan. They're developing the behavioral expectations for that school and for that classroom community. And then they're really taking ownership of that, which helps when issues arise and we need to help students take accountability and responsibility for any actions. And it helps them to also repair any harm that has been done. Because no matter how much we're practicing social emotional learning, issues will arise. We are humans and we are in relationship to each other. So let's move on to more of that repair and what restorative practices does. So how does restorative practices support SEL? We often hear these terms interchangeably, or we hear schools that say, I'm a restorative practice school, or I'm a social emotional learning school. We're really stating that social emotional learning is that larger umbrella which restorative practices and restorative justice falls under. And so as we're shifting from learning about those 5 core competencies of social emotional learning that are provided by CASEL, we really wanted to show the ways that restorative practices is social emotional learning. So in the restorative practice world, we have the 5 R's of restorative practices, which are respect, relationships, responsibility, repair, and reintegration. And those are really well known in the restorative justice world. And what we've done is we've crosswalked each one of the 5 R's with each one of the CASEL competencies. And then under each one of those, we've provided a few restorative practices that meet the needs of each of those competencies and each of those values of restorative practices. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Tyla.
Hi, everyone. So the implementation of proactive and reactive restorative responses is very important when it comes to behavior and discipline. So we wanted to present a discipline scenario that will allow you to kind of gauge what you would do in a situation like this. So Renee is an elementary school student. She's a 3rd grader and she's in the gifted and talented classroom. In this particular situation, she's constantly loud and disruptive, demanding the teacher's attention and often speaking out of turn. When she's not acknowledged immediately, she will get angry and yell and often use inappropriate language. Other students and parents have complained about Renee to the teacher because their children come home with stories of the classroom disruption and being bothered by Renee. Today, the teacher told Renee that she would not be able to go to recess because of her behavior. She spit on the teacher and the teacher sent her to the principal's office. So at this point, from the teacher's view, she cannot deal with this child and it's becoming very disruptive and problematic in her classroom. So she had Renee removed from the class, which we know is an exclusionary discipline response. So in this instance, I want to give you a little bit more of a background on this student's context as well. From a family interaction, on 2 of the previous occasions, on the principal conference with Renee's parents, the parents expressed their belief that the teacher is actually treating Renee differently from other students, and that she's not able to get away with certain behaviors that are allowed from other students in the classroom. And the principal in this instance is treading lightly because he knows that Renee's father was laid off from his job about 6 months ago, and that the family is under a lot of financial stress. So I would like for you guys to do as teachers and administrators and stakeholders, using a restorative approach, what would be your next steps with this student? And we're going to give you guys about 2 or 3 minutes to answer this. And we are going to put a live poll in the chat, which you can click over to, and we will pre-populate your responses as they come in. So a little bit more about restorative justice practices. Restorative justice practices have the potential to reduce tense disciplinary moments through positive discipline, while also incorporating culturally responsive education, which I'll talk about a little more deeply after this segment. So approaching discipline through a critical care lens is a more humanistic approach that acknowledges the sociocultural context in which discipline is being administered. This humanistic approach hones in on the disciplinary moment, which represents the interaction between the teacher and the student that essentially leads to the suspension or whatever other exclusionary disciplinary action is given to the student. So essentially what we're trying to figure out is what is causing the student to act this way and how can the teacher offer the student support. So restorative practices differ from punitive discipline in the sense that the ultimate goal is mediation rather than punishment and repairing harm. So it offers students and teachers and school personnel a chance to respond to conflict or wrongdoing in a way that is meaningful and just. By emphasizing the needs of who was hurt in the situation, encouraging accountability on the student and who was caused the harm, and including the community, restorative justice promotes healing. This allows for more supportive school climate and positive relationships to be built between administrators, teachers, and students, which subsequently leads to rates of exclusionary practices lowering. In restorative justice practices, students may still go to the principal's office when misbehavior occurs, but the procedure is much different from an investigative way of looking at it and a consequential manner. Serious offenses will still, of course, accrue severe consequences, but the majority of offenses can be adequately handled with restorative practices, which is really important. And another way to incorporate restorative justice is to do restorative circles, which are meetings that take place among those involved in the conflict and rely on reflective listening to offer everyone an opportunity to speak and to be heard. This is used to discover the underlying unmet needs and concerns that may trigger the conflict within the student. Restorative circles are used as tools of mutual understanding, action planning, as Layla had mentioned before, and self-responsibility to address and resolve the conflict that resulted in the student's negative behavior. So positive discipline approaches presume that students also need to learn social emotional skills, just as they need to learn their academic skills, and that both students and teachers should be able to share their perspective on the disciplinary moment before consequences are determined. This can be done through, of course, social emotional practices, which teach children and adults to understand and manage their emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy to others, and establish, maintain positive relationships, and ultimately make positive and responsible decisions. So culturally responsive pedagogy is another way to have students heard in their classroom, which we know students' identities, verifying students' identities often has a positive effect on their academic outcomes and their behavioral outcomes as well. So culturally responsive pedagogy draws from students' identities and cultures and helps reshape the traditional teaching and learning setting. Essentially, it helps to build academic and social emotional skills, affirm students' cultural identities, and help students recognize, analyze, and address social inequalities. So what can you as teachers, administrators, and stakeholders do? So we use this learn, act, reflect diagram above to demonstrate how teachers can use culturally responsive pedagogy to create stronger relationships with students and ensure their practices are sound and with student culture and align with student culture and behavior. So the first step is to take the initiative to learn about your students' cultures and behaviors. With this information, teachers could reflect on how to implement their findings into the classroom for behavioral management. And then you can respond to a student's misbehavior in a way that reflects an understanding around the origin of the behavior, honing in on the disciplinary moment and asking yourself what is causing the student to react like this, as well as determining if this is due to a lack of communication or cultural misunderstandings. So this reaction or this interaction between you and the student should be more educational as opposed to punitive. And you can use you can incorporate this within your lessons. So what I do for my students in Bed-Stuy is for a culturally responsive assignment, I would have the students essentially pick a figure from Bed-Stuy, from their neighborhood, the neighborhood that they've grown up in, and talk about why that figure is a leader, why they're empowering, what are some positive qualities about the figure, what are some obstacles that the figure might have faced in their life, and how did they overcome it. And I feel like these assignments like these really help students put themselves in the place of people who have come from their cultural identities, and that relatability helps them academically, behaviorally, and just overall become better, well-rounded students. So here we wanted to ask, how will you guys, moving forward and taking in everything that you've learned today, how will you embed culturally responsive and social emotional learning throughout your day-to-day daily practices within the classroom? And you should feel free to drop any of your answers in the chat. You can also, if you don't want everyone to see it, you can send it directly to myself or any of the other presenters, and we will go about reading it out to you guys.
Okay, and as we come back together and wrap up today's presentation, we want to remind you that this presentation contains hyperlinks and references to supplemental resources, which will all be available to you as attendees of the Inclusion Institute. as well as this recording. And so we've compiled a list of additional resources for teachers that you might find interesting or helpful. They include scholarly articles, websites, podcasts, and also examples of school-based resources for social emotional learning in action provided by Albuquerque Public Schools. And so we invite you to use these to help you, your students, or your team as you see best fit. Also, as a final note, we mentioned the CASEL competencies and action planning earlier in this session. This action planning piece of developing an action plan for your school is really designed or intended for a team. And if you are ready to more specifically plan for how you are going to address these 5 competencies specifically in action as we return to school, we invite you to, we are willing to offer another session for teams where we work through developing an action plan that is relevant to your context and your situation. And if this is something that you're interested in, please feel free to indicate that on your session feedback form. And we do thank you in advance for your feedback. And so we'll wrap up today and open it up for Q&A. You can unmute and ask your questions, or you can drop it in the chat. And we look forward to seeing what you would like to talk about. Thank you, everyone.